All right, so let's jump into this whole trade war thing that might be brewing between the U.S. and China. We've got some articles here, and they suggest that things could heat up again with Trump back in office. It's really interesting to me how differently both sides seem to be handling things now compared to back in 2020.
Yeah, it really is quite a change from just a few years ago. Trump, is known for his aggressive tactics, and the articles highlight how he's not letting up, even threatening a 20% tariff on Chinese goods. But what's interesting is that China doesn't seem to be fazed at all this time around.
Yeah, it's almost like they're calling his bluff right. Back then, China ultimately agreed to a trade deal and said they'd buy billions in U.S. goods. But now, they're barely even responding. What do you think is going on?
Well, one theory is this idea of peak Trump, Essentially, as his presidency goes on, especially with the 2026 midterms coming up, his influence might be waning, especially when it comes to dealing with leaders of those authoritarian regimes like China.
So they see him as a lame duck, just waiting it out until they can deal with someone new.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. Some experts even go so far as to compare Trump to a patsy in this situation. Someone who makes all these big demands but doesn't actually have the leverage to back them up.
Wow, that's a pretty harsh assessment. But I can see how his approach might be giving off that impression. He's all about America first. But if other countries don't see him as a strong leader, that could actually weaken America's position globally in the long run.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this peak Trump idea isn't something everyone agrees on. There are definitely counter-arguments that suggest his influence hasn't diminished as much as some people believe. But whether or not you believe in this particular theory, it's pretty clear that China's playing this very differently this time.
Yeah, for sure. It's like instead of going back and forth with Trump publicly, they're almost ignoring him. No big pronouncements or counter-threats, just a silent, strategic response.
Exactly what some analysts are calling an ignorance strategy. The articles point out that it was the U.S. Treasury Secretary who first reached out to China, not the other way around. That's a pretty clear signal that things have shifted.
So while they may be staying quiet, they're not just sitting back and doing nothing.
Oh, absolutely not. Behind the scenes, China's taking very calculated steps. They're tightening control on exports of what they call strategic minerals to the U.S. We're talking rare earth elements, things that are crucial for manufacturing all kinds of things, from smartphones to weapon systems. By restricting access to these materials, China's putting pressure on U.S. industries that rely on them.
That's a pretty smart move, using their control over these essential resources as leverage. It's not as showy as tariffs, but it could be just as effective, if not more so, over time.
Exactly. And they're not stopping there. China's also been imposing retaliatory tariffs of their own, specifically targeting things like U.S. pickup trucks. This not only hurts American businesses, but also plays well domestically. It shows the Chinese people that their government is standing up to the U.S.
Like a chess game, where they're thinking several moves ahead. They're anticipating Trump's moves and then countering each one strategically.
Precisely. And to make things even more complicated, they're stepping up pressure on U.S. tech companies like Google using antitrust investigations. These investigations could lead to fines, restrictions on their operations in China, and even force them to share technology with Chinese companies.
Wow, so it's like a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
They're hitting back economically, strategically, and technologically.
And if you look at the bigger geopolitical picture, you can see how China is trying to strengthen its position. They're building relationships with countries like Russia. There was even a news report about Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, having a call with Putin, which some see as a deliberate move to snub Trump.
Right. And it makes you wonder if Trump's actions are pushing other countries towards China, even if he didn't intend for that to happen. It's like trying to isolate someone, but then you end up driving them into the arms of another powerful friend.
It's a classic example of unintended consequences in international relations. You try to put pressure on someone, and it creates these ripple effects, strengthening the very alliances you were hoping to weaken.
Yeah, it's all starting to feel like a high-stakes poker game with both sides trying to outmaneuver the other. But with so much at stake, if someone miscalculates, things could go very wrong.
Absolutely. And there's one issue that could really throw a wrench in everything: Taiwan. Trump's stance on Taiwan has been, let's just say, unclear, and that ambiguity could have serious consequences.
Okay, let's talk about Taiwan then. Trump hasn't fully committed to defending Taiwan if China were to attack, which is a pretty big change from how past administrations have handled things.
Right. And that creates a lot of uncertainty, not just for Taiwan, but for the whole region. China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province that needs to be reunited with the mainland. by force if necessary. And if they see any weakness or hesitation from the U.S., it could embolden them to make a move.
So you're saying Trump's tough guy acts might actually backfire here?
Potentially, yeah. If China sees him as a weak strongman, as some experts have said, they might be more likely to test the boundaries and escalate the situation.
It's like he's walking a tightrope, trying to project strength, but also trying to avoid a major conflict. But with so many unpredictable players involved, it's hard to see this ending well for anyone.
It's definitely a complex and volatile situation. But before we jump to conclusions, let's take a closer look at Trump's attempts to use his relationships with other countries like Russia and Mexico in this trade war with China.
Yeah, that's definitely something we need to unpack, because those relationships could have a big impact on how this all plays out. Let's explore that next.
Yeah, it's wild how this whole trade war thing is spilling over into other areas, diplomatically. Trump's trying to bring Russia and Mexico into it, but it's not really clear what he's hoping to get out of it. It seems like he's just looking for any leverage he can find. You have to remember that Trump sees himself as this master deal maker, someone who can bend people to his will just through personality and his negotiation tactics. But as we were just talking about, that doesn't seem to be working with China this time around.
Right, they're now playing along.
Yeah.
So what about Russia? How does that whole relationship play into this trade war?
Well, Trump's history with Putin is complicated, to say the least. On the one hand, he praises Putin for his strength and leadership. But on the other hand, he's put sanctions on Russia and criticized their actions on the world stage. It's a really inconsistent and unpredictable relationship.
So how does it all fit into this trade war between the U.S. and China? Is he trying to use Russia as some kind of counterweight to China?
Some people think that Trump might be trying to play Russia and China off against each other. Like, there was a report that the U.S. was pressuring Mexico to put tariffs on Chinese goods, hoping to mess with China's supply chains and shift trade towards Russia.
That's a bold move, trying to tell another country what to do with their trade policy.
Mm-hmm.
But does it even work? Would Mexico actually go along with that?
It's unlikely that it would be successful in the long run. Mexico has its own economic interests to think about, and they're not just going to become a pawn in Trump's trade war. In fact, putting that kind of pressure on them could backfire and push Mexico closer to China.
Right. It's that the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. If Trump keeps antagonizing other countries, he might accidentally create stronger bonds between them.
Exactly. And it brings us back to this whole peak Trump idea and how his actions are being seen by the rest of the world. If other world leaders think he's unpredictable and unreliable, maybe even desperate, they're not going to want to work with him.
So he's trying to project strength and dominance, but he might actually be weakening America's position globally.
It's a real possibility. And it shows how important it is to understand that in international relations, perception really shapes reality.
So where does that leave us? We got a possible trade war between the U.S. and China, and each side is using completely different tactics. Trump's being super aggressive, trying to force China to give in, but China's staying calm, strategically countering his moves and building stronger ties with countries like Russia.
Yeah, you've summed it up pretty well. And that brings up an important question for our listeners. Given all this complexity, what are the potential long-term consequences of this trade war?
Right, we've talked a lot about the strategies and tactics, but what does it all mean for the bigger picture? How will this impact the global economy relationships between countries and even our everyday lives?
It's impossible to know for sure what will happen, but we can explore some possible scenarios and think about what they could mean for everyone.
Okay, let's do that. Let's say Trump keeps going with this aggressive approach. More tariffs, more pressure on allies like Mexico, and he keeps antagonizing China. What might happen then?
Well, we could see things escalate really quickly, potentially even a full-blown trade war with global consequences.
And what would that actually look like? What would a full-blown trade war actually mean?
Imagine a world where trade between the U.S. and China basically stops. Prices on everyday things go way up because tariffs make things more expensive. Businesses can't adapt to supply chains being disrupted and people lose their jobs. The economy becomes unstable.
That sounds pretty bad. And it's not just about the U.S. and China, right? A trade war between those two would have ripple effects on the whole global economy.
Absolutely. Other countries would have to pick sides, which could lead to new economic blocs forming and the global trading system breaking apart. We could see more protectionism, less investment, and a general slowdown of economic growth all over the world.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It's definitely a worrying possibility. And it highlights how important it is to find ways to manage this rivalry responsibly and stop things from getting out of control.
Okay, so let's look at another scenario.
A new president might focus on de-escalating things and rebuilding trust with China. They might also try to strengthen relationships with other countries and work towards a more multilateral approach to global trade.
So more of a collaborative approach instead of America first.
Exactly. A new administration might realize that in today's world where everything's connected going her, it alone isn't a good strategy.
But even if a new president tries to smooth things over, it seems like the relationship between the U.S. and China has changed fundamentally. There's a lot of distrust and competition now.
That's true. The rivalry between them is probably going to continue no matter who's president. It's driven by bigger geopolitical and economic forces that aren't going to disappear overnight.
So how do we deal with this new reality? Can the U.S. and China coexist peacefully and productively, even if they're not exactly friends?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a delicate balance. Both sides need to recognize each other's interests, manage their differences responsibly, and find areas where they can cooperate for mutual benefit.
So it's not about choosing sides or saying there has to be a winner and a loser. It's more about finding ways to coexist and cooperate, even while they're competing with each other.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the world is complicated and interconnected, and that finding solutions requires communication, understanding, and a willingness to compromise.
That's a tough challenge, but it seems like the only way forward.
It is. And it brings us to another important point: the role of other countries in all of this.
Right, we've been talking a lot about the U.S. and China, but it's not just about them. Other countries like Russia, Mexico, and even Europe are also players in this whole geopolitical chess match.
Absolutely. Their decisions and actions can shift the balance of power, change the rules of global trade, and ultimately decide whether this rivalry leads to cooperation or conflict.
So we have to look at this trade war from a global perspective, not just from an American or Chinese point of view.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more interesting, because while the U.S. and China are competing with each other countries are also pursuing their own interests, forming alliances, and trying to find their place in the global order.
It's like this multi-dimensional chess game where every move has ripple effects across the board.
Yeah.
With so many players, it's hard to keep track of everything that's going on.
It's a complex and constantly changing situation, but if you understand the key dynamics at play, you can start to see the bigger picture and how this global power struggle might play out.
Okay, so we've talked about things possibly escalating the chance of a new administration changing course and the role other countries play in all this.
Right. And to wrap up this part of our discussion, I want to leave you with a question to think about. What role do you as an individual play in this global power struggle?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about how the stuff we buy every day could actually impact something as big as a global trade war. But like you said, all those little choices really do add up.
Yeah, they really do. Every time you buy something, you're supporting that company and what they stand for. If you buy things that are made ethically and sustainably, you're supporting those businesses, and then those businesses can put pressure on governments and organizations to make trade policies more responsible.
So like a ripple effect. It starts with us and spreads out.
Exactly. And it's not just what we buy, but staying informed, talking about these issues with friends and family, even contacting politicians to share our concerns and advocate for policies that support things like fair trade and global cooperation.
So it's not like we're just watching all this happen. We can actually do things to make a difference by being smart shoppers and engaged citizens.
Right. Which brings us back to that big question. What's next for this U.S.-China trade war, and what does it mean for all of us?
Yeah, we've looked at the strategies, different scenarios, and even how we as individuals can have an impact. What happens now? What should we be paying attention to as this all unfolds?
Well, one thing to watch is the 2026 U.S. midterm elections. If Trump's party loses control of Congress, it could weaken his position and make it harder to push his aggressive trade policies. But if they stay in control, we might see him continue or even double down on what he's doing.
So U.S. politics play a big role in this.
Definitely. But it's not just about the U.S. We also need to pay attention to how China reacts. Will they stick with that ignorance strategy, quietly countering Trump while building up their influence? Or will they decide to be more assertive, which could escalate things even further?
And what about all the other countries? They're just going to stand by and watch the U.S. and China fight? Or will they try to step in, maybe try to mediate or even pick sides?
That's another important piece of the puzzle. Countries like Russia, Mexico, and the European nations will be thinking about what's best for them, trying to balance their own interests. Some might try to take advantage of the situation, while others might push for dialogue and cooperation.
Sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty and things could get pretty volatile.
No doubt about it. But even with all this complexity, there's also potential for things to change for the better. This trade war has exposed problems in how global trade works. And it's making us rethink how we approach things like international relations, economic cooperation, and sustainable development.
So maybe this could lead to a more fair and equitable system, one that prioritizes working together instead of fighting, and thinks about the long term, not just profits.
That's what we hope for, right? It won't be easy, and it's going to take everyone working together, governments, businesses, and individuals. But if we recognize that we're all connected and work collaboratively, we can make trade a force for good instead of a source of tension.
That's a great point. This trade war is definitely challenging, but it's also a chance to create a better world. And like we've been saying, we all have a part to play in that.
Absolutely. So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. We're not just along for the ride. We can shape the future through our choices and actions.
And that concludes our deep dive into the U.S.-China trade war. We hope this has been informative and given you some things to think about.
Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding is the first step towards making things better.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. See you next time.